I was running late for work when my wife, Vanessa, called from upstairs, asking me to grab her phone charger from her bag. Normally, I wouldn't have gone digging around in her things. It felt intrusive, even after 12 years of marriage, but I was in a rush, and she sounded frazzled. Her bag was sitting by the entryway, slouched against the wall. I unzipped it, rifling through notebooks, receipts, and loose pens. That's when my fingers brushed against something smooth and metallic. Curious, I pulled it out. A golden pass card, small and pristine, with party embossed in bold, elegant letters across its surface. I turned it over, expecting to find some hint of what it was for. A date, an address, a company logo, but there was nothing. The card seemed deliberately mysterious, like an invitation to something exclusive. Vanessa never mentioned anything about a party, and I couldn't imagine why she'd need something so elaborate. It didn't look like a typical business invite. Sliding it back into her bag, I tried to push the thought aside. Vanessa worked in event planning and often attended fancy mixers and conferences. This was probably just another one of those. But as I drove to the office, the image of that card lingered in my mind, and a small, nagging voice whispered, "This doesn't feel right." By lunchtime, I couldn't concentrate on work. My curiosity had morphed into unease. Was she keeping something from me, or was I just overthinking it? Whatever the answer, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be able to let it go. The thought of the golden card consumed me for the rest of the day. I tried to shake it off, but it gnawed at the edges of my focus. By the time I got home, I had already decided. I needed to know what that card was for. Vanessa was in the kitchen when I walked in, humming to herself as she stirred something on the stove. She greeted me with her usual warm smile, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt for doubting her. But then my eyes drifted to her bag on the counter, and that nagging feeling returned. I waited until she went upstairs to shower before I retrieved the card. This time I examined it more closely. There was a faint engraving on the back. The Avalon Club. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. I did a quick online search, and within seconds, I found their website. The Avalon Club wasn't just any venue. It was a high-end, members-only establishment, tucked away on the outskirts of the city. Their website was discreet, offering little detail beyond phrases like exclusive experiences and an escape from the ordinary. A tiny button labeled Enter Code glinted at the bottom of the page. The realization hit me like a cold wave. This wasn't a work-related event. I tried to convince myself that Vanessa had a perfectly reasonable explanation, but I couldn't ignore the unease creeping up my spine. By the time Vanessa came back downstairs, I had slipped the card back into her bag. She looked refreshed, glowing in the way she always did after a long shower, but I couldn't bring myself to meet her eyes. "Dinner's ready," she said, her voice cheerful. I forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. Over dinner, we talked about our days as usual. She mentioned a new client, and I shared some updates from work, but the conversation felt hollow. My mind was elsewhere, already planning my next move. If Vanessa wasn't going to tell me what the Avalon Club was, I'd have to find out myself. I wasn't proud of the idea, but the doubt festering inside me left me no choice. Later that night, after Vanessa had fallen asleep, I took the card again and entered the code into the Avalon Club's website. A confirmation popped up, revealing an address and the words, "Admit one, 9 p.m. this Friday." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Whatever this was, it was happening tomorrow night, and I was going to be there. Friday arrived with the heavy weight of anticipation pressing down on me. Every glance at Vanessa felt sharper. Every casual smile she gave me tinged with an edge of suspicion. I couldn't tell if I was projecting or if she sensed something, but the silence between us that morning at breakfast was louder than usual. The card sat snug in my pocket as I drove to work. I didn't know what I expected to find tonight, but my imagination refused to sit still. Maybe it was just a bizarre networking event, something so highbrow and secretive that I couldn't comprehend it. Maybe she was helping plan an exclusive event for a client and didn't bother mentioning it to me. Those possibilities felt thin, fragile compared to the darker suspicions clawing at my thoughts. Work dragged by, every ticking second reminding me of the clock counting down to 9 p.m. I excused myself early, blaming exhaustion, and told Vanessa I planned to go to bed early. She had nodded, half distracted, as she gathered her things and kissed me on the cheek. "Don't wait up for me," she said casually. That statement should have comforted me. If she wasn't planning to be home by 9 p.m., it likely meant she'd be at this Avalon Club event. But instead of relief, all I felt was a strange sense of dread, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the drop was inevitable. At 8:45, I parked a block away from the club's address, my car blending into the dark suburban streets. The building was unassuming, a low-slung structure with frosted windows and no sign. The only indication that I was in the right place was the steady stream of well-dressed individuals filtering through the discreet entrance. I watched from a distance, studying their faces. They looked polished and confident, as though they belonged to some exclusive world I had never been a part of. Men in tailored suits and women in cocktail dresses or elegant evening gowns. Swallowing my nerves, I stepped out of the car and approached the door. The bouncer, a massive man in a crisp black suit, eyed me with practiced disinterest. "Card?" he asked, his voice low and neutral. I handed it over, the small golden pass suddenly feeling like a ticket to another dimension. He scanned it briefly, nodded, and gestured me inside. The interior was a study in decadence. Low amber lighting cast warm shadows over plush furniture and gilded fixtures. A faint scent of vanilla and musk hung in the air. My ears caught snippets of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of an ambient soundtrack. The hostess, a stunning woman in a floor-length dress with a slit that seemed more suggestive than practical, approached me with a welcoming smile. "Welcome to Avalon," she said, her voice silky. "Enjoy the party." Her hand brushed my shoulder lightly as she stepped aside, and I stepped forward into the main room. My breath caught. The space opened into a sprawling lounge, and I was greeted by a sight that stole every coherent thought from my mind. People. Naked people. Dozens of them, their bodies glowing under soft, golden light. Some lounged on velvet couches, others danced to the hypnotic music, their movements fluid and uninhibited. But it was the corners of the room that held my attention, the intimate acts unfolding in plain view. Couples, trios, and larger groups intertwined with one another, their moans and whispers blending with the ambient music. Tables held bottles of oils, feathers, and other items that hinted at a level of eroticism I had never encountered. My heart thundered in my chest as I stood there, frozen. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, to pretend I had never set foot in this place. But then I saw her, Vanessa. She was near the center of the room, laughing as she leaned against a tall man with broad shoulders. Her body glistened under the warm lights, and her smile, the one I thought I knew better than my own reflection, radiated joy and abandon. But it wasn't just him. Another man was at her side, whispering something into her ear, his hands roaming her waist. A woman knelt at her feet, pouring oil into her palms before running them up Vanessa's legs. The air seemed to vanish from my lungs. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Vanessa, the woman I had shared my life with for over a decade, was here, naked, entwined with strangers, reveling in a world I hadn't even known existed. Before I could stop myself, the words burst from me, raw and sharp. "What are you doing here?" My voice cut through the music, freezing the scene in an instant. Heads turned toward me, a ripple of curiosity spreading through the crowd. Vanessa's laughter died mid-breath, her face snapping toward me. The shock in her eyes mirrored my own. She froze, her body stiffening as the blood drained from her face. I didn't know what I expected her to say. Maybe an explanation, some excuse that could make sense of this surreal nightmare. But all she managed was a strangled, whispered, "James!" The sound of my name from her lips, in this setting, felt like a knife to the chest. I could feel the weight of every stare in the room, the collective tension thick enough to choke me. And then, everything shattered. The room around me blurred into a haze of faces and golden light. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my fists clenched instinctively at my sides. Vanessa stood frozen, her body stiff, caught between the two men and the chaos she'd created. James, she started, her voice trembling, but I didn't let her finish. What the hell is this? I roared, the fury bubbling up from somewhere deep, raw, and primal. The sound of my voice cut through the ambient music, leaving a silence heavy enough to crush the air from the room. Vanessa flinched, her hands instinctively covering herself as though modesty mattered now. The others began to pull away, retreating like shadows under a bright light. Whispers filled the room, low murmurs punctuated by the occasional awkward cough. You brought me into this, I yelled, pointing a shaking hand at the card still burning in my pocket. You lied to me, Vanessa. You lied. And this is what you've been doing. The two men at her sides shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, unsure whether to stay or leave. One of them, the taller man, muttered, Hey, maybe we should. Shut up. I snapped, my eyes narrowing on him, and he stepped back like a scolded dog. Vanessa finally moved, grabbing a robe from a nearby chair and pulling it over her shoulders. Her face, normally so composed and radiant, now looked pale and twisted in panic. James, please, she pleaded, her voice cracking. I wanted to stop coming here. I tried, but I couldn't. Her words hit like a cold slap. You couldn't? What does that even mean, Vanessa? I demanded, incredulous. It became something I couldn't control, she said, her voice desperate. I didn't plan for it to go this far, but it spiraled. Spiraled, I thundered, throwing my arms wide. You mean to tell me you spiraled your way into strangers in front of an audience? Her lip quivered, and the tears spilled over, streaking her cheeks. It's not like that, she whispered. Then what is it like, Vanessa? What the hell is this? I gestured at the men, who were now awkwardly inching their way toward the door. I thought, she choked on her words, her voice cracking under the weight of her tears. I thought I could handle it, that I could keep it separate. I didn't want this to touch us. You didn't want this to touch us? I barked, my voice raw with disbelief. You're here, Vanessa, with them. It doesn't get more touched than this. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed, clutching the robe tighter around her trembling body. I didn't mean for you to find out like this, she whimpered. That's not an answer, I growled. Around us, the crowd had thinned. People avoided our space, retreating into corners or slipping out the door altogether. But I barely noticed. The entire world had narrowed to this moment, to her, and to the wreckage she'd left in her wake. Why? I asked finally, my voice breaking despite my best effort to keep it steady. Why would you do this? Was I not enough for you? Were we not enough? Vanessa shook her head frantically, fresh tears streaming down her face. It's not about you, James. It was never about you. That's not an answer, I snapped. I felt trapped, she blurted out, her voice desperate, as though forcing the truth out might save her. Our life, it's perfect, but it's suffocating sometimes. I needed something that was just mine. Her words were a dagger, sliding between my ribs. And this is what you chose? I asked bitterly. I didn't want to lose you, she said, her voice breaking again. You lost me the moment you walked into this place, I said, my tone like ice. Vanessa staggered, her legs buckling slightly as though the weight of my words had struck her physically. She clutched the edge of a nearby chair for balance, her face crumpling under the pressure. The tension in the room was unbearable, the silence so thick it was hard to breathe. And then, with no warning, Vanessa swayed and collapsed. I barely had time to react before she crumpled to the floor, her body limp. Gasps rippled through the room as people froze in place, unsure of what to do. I rushed to her side, my emotions swirling in chaos. My hand trembled as I checked her pulse. It was there, steady but faint. She'd fainted, overwhelmed by the confrontation, the guilt, the enormity of what she'd done. But even as I knelt there, The realization was already crystallizing in my mind. This was the end. There was no saving this. No saving us. Vanessa had made her choice. And now, so would I. I sat on the floor, cradling Vanessa's limp form in my arms as the murmur of the crowd slowly faded into the background. Her robe hung loosely around her, and her face was pale, her lashes wet with tears. For a fleeting moment, the instincts I had built over 12 years of marriage kicked in. I wanted to protect her, to comfort her, to make sure she was okay. But the weight of her betrayal crushed that instinct as quickly as it had risen. She wasn't the woman I thought she was. She wasn't the Vanessa I had built a life with, the one who stood beside me through triumphs and struggles. That Vanessa had been an illusion, and now, I was holding the shattered remains of that illusion in my arms. Someone knelt beside me. A woman from the crowd, still partially nude but now draped in a throw blanket. "She's breathing," the woman said softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "It looks like she fainted from the stress. Do you want us to call someone?" I shook my head, my voice sharp and cold.
No.
"I'll handle it." The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning my face as though trying to assess my state of mind. Finally, she nodded and retreated, leaving me alone with Vanessa. I glanced around the room, now much emptier than before. Those who remained watched from the periphery, their faces a mix of pity and discomfort. I couldn't bear their stares. With a grunt of effort, I lifted Vanessa off the floor and carried her toward the nearest exit. Her body felt heavier than it should have, weighed down by the invisible burden of her choices and the devastation they had wrought. As I stepped into the cool night air, Vanessa stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. "James," she whispered, her voice weak. "Don't," I snapped, my tone harsher than I intended. "Save it." She didn't respond, her head lolling against my shoulder as I carried her to the car. I set her down gently in the passenger seat, buckled her in, and closed the door. For a moment, I stood there, gripping the roof of the car, trying to steady myself. My hands shook, and my breath came in short, uneven gasps. I had to keep it together. I had to get us home. The drive was silent. Vanessa didn't say a word, and I didn't look at her. The streetlights blurred past in a haze, and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound. My mind churned, replaying the scene in vivid detail, her laughter, her body entwined with strangers, the way she looked at me when she realized I had caught her. She tried to stop. She said that as if it absolved her. But the truth was, she didn't stop. She didn't choose me. When we pulled into the driveway, I killed the engine and stared at the dashboard. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't move. "James." Vanessa's voice broke the silence, weak and trembling. I turned to her, my expression hard and unyielding. "Get out." She blinked, her lips parting as if to protest. I said, "Get out." I repeated, my tone cold and final. She opened the door and stepped out slowly, her movements unsteady. I followed, locking the car behind us. Without a word, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, leaving it open for her to follow. Once inside, I turned to her, my arms crossed over my chest. She stood just inside the doorway, looking small and frail under the harsh light of the entryway. "We're done," I said, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. Her eyes widened, and she took a step forward. "James, no, please. Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand to stop her. "Don't you dare try to justify this. Don't you dare try to spin this into something I'm supposed to understand or forgive." She broke down, her sobs racking her body as she sank to her knees. "I was lost," she cried, her voice muffled. "I didn't know how to stop. Lost." I scoffed, the bitterness seeping into my words.
No, Vanessa.
"You weren't lost. You knew exactly what you were doing. You made those choices every single time." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered. "Then why did you?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Why, Vanessa? If you didn't want to hurt me, why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you talk to me?" She couldn't answer. Her sobs filled the silence, and I felt a pang of something. Grief, perhaps, or regret for what could have been. But it was fleeting. "You made your choice," I said, my tone softening but still firm. "Now I'm making mine." With that, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her alone in the entryway. As I climbed the stairs, a strange sense of clarity settled over me. The Vanessa I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. I reached the bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. My heart ached, but deep down, I knew this was the beginning of the end. And for the first time in hours, I felt a sliver of peace. The next morning, the house was unnervingly quiet. The usual rhythm of our home, coffee brewing, Vanessa humming in the kitchen, the faint hum of the news on TV, was conspicuously absent. The air felt heavy, as if the house itself had absorbed the weight of what had happened. I stayed upstairs for a long time, staring out the bedroom window at the empty street. My mind raced, replaying everything from the night before. Every tear, every word, every hollow excuse Vanessa had offered swirled in my thoughts, each one digging deeper into the wound. Eventually, I heard movement downstairs. I knew it was her, probably trying to decide what to say, or if she should say anything at all. Part of me hoped she'd just leave quietly. That would be easier, wouldn't it? No more confrontation, no more painful words exchanged. But deep down, I knew we weren't done. Not yet. When I finally descended the stairs, Vanessa was sitting at the dining table, clutching a mug of coffee like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. She looked up as I entered, her face pale and puffy from crying. She didn't speak, but her eyes were pleading, searching mine for something. Understanding, forgiveness, anything. I didn't give her the satisfaction. "We need to talk," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she set the mug down. "I know." I sat across from her, folding my arms on the table. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. "I'm filing for divorce," I said bluntly. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Her face crumpled, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "James, please," she whispered. "Don't do this. We can fix this. We can." "No, Vanessa," I interrupted, my voice firm. "We can't. Do you even hear yourself? There's no coming back from this. You've been doing this for over a year. A year. Do you know how insane that is? How calculated it had to be?" She flinched, her sobs growing louder. "I never wanted it to go this far," she choked out. "But it did," I shot back. "And every step of the way you had a choice. You chose this. You chose to betray me, to lie to me, to risk everything we had." Her hands flew to her face as she broke down completely, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. I leaned back, my anger simmering but no longer boiling over. The weight of my decision was heavy, but it felt right. "You don't get to cry, Vanessa," I said quietly. "Not after what you've done." She dropped her hands, her tear-streaked face a mask of desperation. "I love you," she said, her voice barely audible. I shook my head slowly. "No, you don't. You love the life we built, the comfort and security of it. But if you really loved me, you wouldn't have done this." Her lips trembled, but she didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. I stood, pushing the chair back with a scrape. "You can stay here until we figure out the logistics. But I'm done. We're done." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. "James, please, don't walk away. I'll do anything, therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us." I paused, my chest tightening. For a brief moment, I considered her words. Part of me wanted to believe we could fix this, that we could salvage what was left. But then I remembered the image of her in that room, laughing, smiling, tangled in the arms of strangers. The way she had hidden this from me, lied to my face for over a year. There was no fixing this. "I already have," I said, my voice quiet but resolute. Her sobs followed me as I walked away, but I didn't look back. I grabbed my keys, stepped outside, and drove aimlessly for hours, letting the silence of the car swallow me whole. By the time I returned home, the house was dark, and Vanessa was nowhere to be seen. Her car was still in the driveway, but I didn't bother checking where she was. I climbed the stairs, locked the bedroom door behind me, and collapsed onto the bed. For the first time in years, I slept soundly. In the morning, I would call a lawyer. But for now, I allowed myself to feel the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. The morning light filtered through the blinds, painting stripes across the bedroom walls. For the first time in what felt like forever, I woke up without the crushing weight of confusion and betrayal. The reality was still there, raw and jagged, but it felt manageable now, like a wound I could tend to instead of an overwhelming storm. Downstairs, the house was eerily silent. Vanessa's car was still in the driveway, but she hadn't made a sound since last night. Part of me wondered if she was giving me space, or if she simply didn't know how to face me again. Either way, it didn't matter. I had made up my mind. I brewed coffee, the mundane routine grounding me, giving me a sense of normalcy. The smell filled the kitchen as I pulled out my phone and began the search for a divorce attorney. Each tap of the screen felt like another step away from the wreckage of my marriage and closer to the freedom I craved. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about what life would look like without Vanessa. It was strange, daunting even, to imagine days that weren't tied to her laughter, her habits, her presence. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of myself I had lost over the years. I had spent so long being us, that I had forgotten how to be just me. A soft sound broke my thoughts, and I looked up to see Vanessa standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from a night of crying. She looked at me as if waiting for permission to speak, but I gave her none. "Good morning," she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, taking another sip of coffee. I didn't want to engage, didn't want to open the floodgates to another emotional conversation. "I'm sorry," she added, her voice trembling. I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. "I know," I said simply. And with that, I stood, took my mug, and walked past her. There was nothing left to say. The first thing I felt as I stepped out into the crisp morning air was peace. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there. A small, steady reminder that I was heading toward something better. I spent the day methodically untangling my life from Vanessa's. It wasn't dramatic or impulsive. There was no throwing clothes into suitcases or shouting matches. It was quiet, deliberate, and necessary. After calling a divorce attorney and scheduling an appointment, I went upstairs to the bedroom and began packing my things. Every item I folded into the suitcase felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. Shirts, ties, books, things I had barely noticed before suddenly felt symbolic. They were mine, not ours, and I wanted to take them with me into whatever came next. Vanessa stayed out of sight, her presence reduced to the occasional creak of the floorboards as she moved through the house. I didn't know if she was giving me space out of respect or guilt, but either way I was grateful. By the time I finished packing, the weight on my chest had started to lift. The idea of leaving this house, the one we had shared for so many years, didn't feel sad or painful anymore. It felt like escape, like walking out of a cage I hadn't realized I'd been trapped in. I placed the last suitcase by the door and took one final walk through the house. Memories flashed in my mind like snapshots. Lazy Sundays on the couch, quiet dinners in the kitchen, laughter echoing down the halls. They were good memories, but they felt hollow now, tainted by the knowledge of what Vanessa had been hiding. When I reached the entryway, Vanessa was there, leaning against the wall. Her arms were crossed tightly, and her eyes were fixed on the floor. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Yes," I said simply, meeting her gaze. She nodded slowly, tears pooling in her eyes. "I didn't want it to end like this," she whispered. "Neither did I replied, my voice calm but firm. "But you made your choices, Vanessa." I picked up my suitcase and stepped outside. The air was cool and fresh, and as I walked to the car, I felt lighter than I had in years. I didn't look back as I pulled out of the driveway. The house that had been our home for 12 years faded into the distance, becoming just another stop on a road I was determined to leave behind. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as a mixture of emotions swirled within me. Grief, anger, and an odd, budding sense of relief. For a long time I drove aimlessly. The city stretched out around me, a maze of familiar streets and landmarks that now felt foreign. Everything seemed touched by the shadow of what had happened. The park where we'd picnicked on sunny afternoons, the coffee shop where we'd shared quiet mornings. It all carried the weight of memories I wasn't ready to confront. Eventually, I found myself at a small motel on the outskirts of town. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly in the early evening light. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. I checked in, unpacked my bag, and collapsed onto the stiff bed, staring at the blank ceiling. The silence in the room was deafening, and for the first time, I truly felt the void Vanessa's betrayal had created. It wasn't just about her infidelity. It was the loss of everything I thought we were, the life we had built, and the future I had envisioned. I thought about the moments leading up to this. Could I have done something differently? Had I missed the signs? But the more I reflected, the clearer it became. This wasn't my failure. It was hers. She had made the choices that led us here, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. A knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. For a fleeting second, I thought it might be Vanessa, chasing me down to plead for another chance. But when I opened it, it was just the motel manager, dropping off a spare key. As I closed the door, I exhaled deeply. The weight of the day pressed down on me, but there was something else there too. Something faint, almost imperceptible. Hope. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was mine to decide. The following days were a blur of adjustments and small victories. I extended my stay at the motel for another week, needing time to figure out my next steps. The tiny room, with its faded wallpaper and humming air conditioner, became my refuge. A place where I could be alone with my thoughts without the oppressive weight of the past looming over me. Each morning, I woke early, the faint light creeping through the thin curtains signaling the start of another day. At first, I didn't know what to do with the silence. It was deafening, suffocating. I wasn't used to the absence of Vanessa's voice, her movements, her presence. But as the days passed, the silence became something else. Peaceful. I filled my time with purpose. I called my lawyer and began the divorce proceedings in earnest. The conversations were clinical and to the point, stripping away the emotion that had consumed me the night I walked into the Avalon Club. My attorney, a no-nonsense professional named Karen, assured me that things would move quickly given the circumstances. "You're doing the right thing," she said during our second meeting. "It's hard now, but you'll thank yourself later." I didn't respond, but I could feel the truth in her words. Each step I took, canceling joint accounts, gathering financial records, documenting the details of Vanessa's betrayal, felt like shedding another layer of the life we had shared. It was painful, but it was also liberating. In the afternoons, I went for long drives. I found myself drawn to places I hadn't visited in years. Quiet hiking trails, a small diner I used to frequent before I met Vanessa, even the library where I used to spend hours lost in books. These places felt untouched by the pain of recent events, like they belonged to a version of me I had forgotten. It wasn't long before I started rediscovering pieces of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. I dusted off my old camera, a hobby I had abandoned after Vanessa and I got married. The act of capturing the world through a lens felt meditative, like I was finally seeing the beauty around me again. One afternoon, as I stood by a serene lake, the golden light reflecting off the water, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. It wasn't overwhelming or dramatic. It was quiet and subtle, like the gentle ripples on the surface of the lake. Vanessa called me once during this time. The sound of her name flashing on my phone screen made my stomach twist, but I let it go to voicemail. Later, when I finally listened, her voice was shaky, uncertain. "James," she began, pausing as if searching for the right words. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if it can be fixed, but I just wanted you to know how sorry I am." Her words hung in the air as the voicemail ended, but they didn't have the power to sway me. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want excuses. What I needed was freedom. By the end of the week, I had found a small apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with a tiny kitchen and a view of a busy street, but it was mine. As I unpacked my boxes and arranged my belongings, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This was the start of something new, something I could build without the weight of Vanessa's betrayal. That night, as I stood on the balcony watching the city lights, I realized how far I had come in just a few days. The pain was still there, but it no longer consumed me. In its place was something stronger: resilience, clarity, and the quiet promise of a better future. I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe it. I was going to be okay. The first morning in my new apartment was unremarkable, yet it felt monumental. The sunlight streamed through the thin curtains I hadn't yet replaced, casting a warm glow across the room. It was quiet, save for the faint hum of traffic outside and the occasional chirp of birds. For the first time in years, I woke up to a day that was entirely mine. I brewed coffee in the tiny kitchen, the aroma filling the space. There were no echoes of past conversations, no reminders of a life I no longer belonged to. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but there was a strange comfort in the simplicity. It was a blank canvas, waiting for me to create something new. Sitting at the small dining table, I sipped my coffee and thought about everything I'd been through. The anger and heartbreak still lingered, like distant thunder on the horizon, but they no longer dictated my every thought. Instead, I felt an odd sense of gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it had brought me. Vanessa had made her choice, and so had I. Holding on to the life we had shared, trying to salvage something from the wreckage, would have only prolonged the inevitable. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Later that day, I ventured out to explore the neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, just a mix of old storefronts and modest homes, but it felt real in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I stumbled upon a cozy little cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop, the kind of place where the barista knows your name after the second visit. I ordered a latte and took a seat by the window, watching the world go by. People walked past, chatting, laughing, living their lives. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I pulled out a small notebook I had found while unpacking the night before, one I hadn't used in years. Flipping to a blank page, I began to write. Not about the past, but about the future. Dreams, goals, small things I wanted to do now that I had the freedom to pursue them. As the words filled the page, I felt a lightness I hadn't known I was capable of. I was no longer bound by the expectations of a broken marriage or the weight of betrayal. By the time I left the cafe, the sun was setting, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the colors fade into dusk. This was my life now, and for the first time in a long time I was truly living it. I wasn't defined by what had happened to me or by the choices Vanessa had made. I was free, and I didn't regret a single thing.